It's the 1st of July 1863 and one small town in Pennsylvania is about to have its name etched into American folklore. Gettysburg. At the time it was home to around 2,400 people. Yet over the course of the next 3 days, over 165,000 troops from the Union and the Confederate forces would engage in the bloodiest battle of the American Civil War. And despite the conflict continuing for nearly 2 more years, the Battle of Gettysburg is considered a turning point, marking the end of General Robert E. Lee's plans to invade the North and bring the war to a close. I'm James Hanson and welcome to History Undone, the show where we look at how the briefest of moments can shape our world. Every week we focus on a different historical battle, and with the help of our experts we ask whether split-second decisions could have changed the outcome and history itself. Today, it's the Battle of Gettysburg, a brutal standoff that claimed the lives of over 51,000 troops. Defeat for the Confederate States didn't end the Civil War, but just how decisive was it? That's a question for our experts, and joining me once again in the studio is the historian and author, Rear Admiral Dr Parry, and from the United States, Dr Timothy Orr, Associate Professor of History at Old Dominion University. Welcome to you both. Let's begin with the lay of the land in the summer of 1863. We have before us, Chris, a huge map of the United States. Obviously, we're the northern states. We've got the Southern Confederacy here in green, and we've got the other territories as well. Just describe what's been happening in the 2 years up until the summer of 1863.
Well, the presidency of Abraham Lincoln has precipitated a crisis amongst the various states in the South. I think everybody knows that quite a few of them were slave-owning states. Indeed, some in the North are slave-owning states as well. But it's fundamentally about states' rights. We've got to remember the United States was exactly that. A union of states, and they all have individual rights, they have privileges, they have their own legislatures, for example. So they say, look, whether it's about slavery or anything else, we'd like to make our own decisions and we'd like to be respected for that. And Abraham Lincoln obviously is committed to an anti-slavery agenda. He's committed to a number of other issues as well associated with his presidency. And the bottom line is that 13 states say, look, we're going to secede progressively from the Union because we can't put up with this anymore. We want to run our own lives, and they elect their own president, vice president, and they set themselves up in Richmond, Virginia, which is not very far to the south of Washington. So the two capitals are very close together. And they set about raising armies, and the North obviously consolidates its navy, and they slip into war. And the main theatres of war in the early stages are, not surprisingly, in the borderlands between where Washington and Richmond are. So that's respectively Maryland, Pennsylvania, District of Columbia, facing south on to Virginia, which is an immensely powerful state. And what has happened is members of the US Army have said, look, we come from either a southern state or a northern state, and they start joining the respective armies. And what you see is a Confederate army being put together. You see a Union army. It's all very haphazard. It's very much like the English Civil War. You see politicians and other people raising their own regiments. You see the state trying to bring in more formal arrangements for building not only the main army, but logistics, artillery, and things like that. And by the time we get to 1863, there have been a number of campaigns, and the most significant ones have been, as I said, in this borderland between Virginia and the North. A series of river systems, towns, cities, and extensive farmland. So you can fight over it and live off the land as well. More significantly, the Confederacy has discovered it's got some very talented generals, not least one called Robert E. Lee. And in 1862, the Confederacy conducts a thing called the Maryland Campaign. And what they're trying to do is put pressure on the peace elements in the North by putting an army on the northern side of the border. It's in Maryland. Maryland is actually a slave state, although it's in the North. So they're trying to get Maryland to secede as well. They also, the Confederate States are trying to get the support of England and France, trying to legitimize their regime and get supplies and armaments from them. And they also want to put pressure on Washington, Baltimore and Philadelphia, these three big cities that constitute part of the Union. And the idea is, let's put pressure on the Northerners, and also some people in the North who support actually quite a lot of what the Confederacy is about, and see if we can actually get peace out of that. And what enables that is a funneling arrangement in the topography, the Shenandoah Valley, which enables the Confederate forces to march into the north almost unopposed and screened by the mountains to the east. And that results in an indecisive battle called Antietam, very much like Gettysburg in some ways. And the Confederate army goes back to Virginia to recoup. And essentially in 1863, it's a repeat of that to try and put political pressure on the Union, to threaten Washington, Baltimore and Philadelphia, and also for Lee to say, look, I've got a 72,000 man army here. The farmlands of Northern Virginia are actually getting pretty exhausted. Let's go and live off the land in the Union farmlands in the north. And what's interesting about Lee is he said, this is not a pillage expedition. You're going to pay for everything. And the Confederate army goes through the motions of actually paying for everything they take from the local farmers. Problem is, it's in Confederate currency, which may not actually be transferable into the North.
And of course, part of the significance of Gettysburg is it's a battle on northern soil. Let's just point it out on the map. Where exactly is Gettysburg?
Okay, so Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania. Okay, so you come out of northern Virginia into Maryland and into Pennsylvania. One other thing I need to mention, James, is that the Union has control of the Navy, very much so. The Confederacy doesn't have a big Navy. It's got a lot of privateers, but it has got some merchant ships, but the northern states have an absolute monopoly over armed force at sea. So they're able to impose a blockade in 1862 to stop armaments and other supplies getting into the Confederacy. And of course, the Confederacy exporting things like cotton to Europe and places like that.
Tim, I want to bring you in. I suppose one of the key things to say before we get into the Battle of Gettysburg itself is that at this point in the summer of 1863, General Robert E. Lee is on a bit of a roll.
He is indeed. I mean, he had assumed command of the Army of Northern Virginia during the first week of June 1862. So he's not the original commander of that army, but he's simply a replacement commander when the previous commander of that army, Joseph Johnston, is wounded outside of Richmond. And Lee takes command of this army with gusto. He uses it boldly, and he's able to win some unexpected victories over a much larger northern army that's sent against him, the Army of the Potomac, time and again, with far fewer men. And he becomes something of a early Southern hero. Many of the Confederate newspapers praise Lee for having saved Richmond from occupation in the summer of 1862. And he remains the permanent commander of the Army of Northern Virginia until the end of the war. And ever since he assumed command, he wins these big, unpredictable battles against the Army of the Potomac. And there were two follow-ups after the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Fredericksburg in December of 1862, and then most recently in May of 1863, the Battle of Chancellorsville, in which Lee's army was practically outnumbered by 2 to 1. And these victories not only just catapult Lee into sort of military stardom, but they also give Lee a lot of confidence in his troops. He was a general who was beloved by his men and loved the men he commanded. And so by the summer of 1863, Lee believes he has an unbeatable army. And many of the Confederate politicians who discussed matters of strategy with him kind of believe this as well, that Lee often spoke of commanding an army that was invincible. And it leads to one of Lee's kind of big flaws during the Gettysburg campaign, which is overconfidence. But it is definitely an understandable overconfidence, considering all of the incredible successes that his army had achieved in the few months that he had been in command.
Well, that's the background. Let's zoom in now and let's focus on the events of early July 1863. OK, we've got a new map in front of us now. This is Gettysburg and the lay of the land in early July 1863. Tim, I'm going to set you a bit of a challenge. Can you explain what happened over the 3 days of the Battle of Gettysburg in about 5 minutes? And whilst you do that, Dr Chris and I are going to move blocks around the board to represent the various divisions. We should say the black is going to represent the Union line and the red is going to represent the Confederate line. So when you're ready, Tim, take it away.
All right. So the Battle of Gettysburg is 3 days, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. Each day is very different. Now, the first day is the meeting engagement, when the two armies arrive on the field simultaneously. Now, the Confederate plan that day is to use Gettysburg as a rendezvous point. Their army is scattered, and they're trying to bring it together as quickly as possible, and Gettysburg is the ideal place to do it because 10 major roads lead into Gettysburg from all directions. It is the seat of Adams County, Pennsylvania, and a perfect rendezvous point. However, the Union Army has already arrived prior to the Confederates getting there, and the Union plans are simply to frustrate that rendezvous. So when Confederate divisions arrive from the north and west side of Gettysburg, they will initially engage Union cavalry that are dismounted outside of town, but soon Union infantry will come in and take up the fight. And Robert E. Lee is a bit upset that this engagement has occurred because he has told his corps and divisional commanders not to bring upon a general engagement until the army has been concentrated. But some of his vanguard troops violate these orders, engage the Army of the Potomac anyway, and by midday on July 1st, Lee decides that he is going to commit to the battle that has been started, orders all of his troops to assemble at Gettysburg, and by the afternoon, his army will be in a great position to dislodge the Union. They will have about 27,000 Confederate soldiers on the field to 22,000 Union soldiers, and they overwhelm the Union force and force it to retreat southward through the borough of Gettysburg. Now, the Union forces will rally on the hills and ridges south of the town, and over the nighttime hours of July the 1st, the rest of the Union Army will arrive on the field. They had only 2 corps on the field on July the 1st, but they will have 7 corps on the field on July the 2nd. So the second day of the battle is a continuation where the Confederate plan is to attack the Union Army in its new position. And the Union position is very good. It is on high ground. It is on a position where the Union can use interior lines of battle, which means the ends of their army are a lot closer together, so it's easier for them to shift troops to threatened areas. And we generally describe the Union position on the second day as a fishhook-shaped line, where the eye of the fishhook is at a rocky hill to the south called Little Round Top, and then it runs north for about 1.5 miles along what's called Cemetery Ridge, and then it curves at a place called Cemetery Hill, named for the town cemetery, and then the barb of the fishhook, the Union right flank, is at a place called Culp's Hill. So the flanks are secured, it's on high ground, there's great visibility. Now, Lee decides to attack the Union Army where it stands on July the 2nd, and the main focus is on the flanks of the army. His plan is to try to attack the right flank and the left flank simultaneously so the Union cannot shift troops. Now, it does not go the way that Lee wants it. He attacks these 2 flanks, but the attacks are not simultaneous. So the Union is able to shift troops to the threatened areas, and after a full day of fighting, the bloodiest of the 3 days, the Union line holds firm. Now, Lee's plan for the third day is initially to do the same thing that he did on the second, to attack the flanks again. But once again, poor coordination hampers this effort. Only one of the flank attacks occurs, and that is the one against the Union right. There's a 7-hour-long battle against the Union right at Culp's Hill, and then the attack at the Union left does not materialize. The Confederate commander there delays, and it never happens. So Lee decides that he has to do something in the afternoon hours of July the 3rd. His plan is a big gamble to amass a lot of artillery and infantry against the Union center, which is along Cemetery Ridge. So he amasses about 140 cannon along the Confederate position, which is called Seminary Ridge, named for the Lutheran Theological Seminary at Gettysburg. There is a 2-hour barrage as Confederate artillery shells the center of the Union line. And then this massed infantry assault, which is today known as Pickett's Charge, crosses the field between the two armies, and they attack the Union position, and they are soundly defeated, losing over 60% of their forces. And by that point, Lee realizes he has been defeated. He has attacked the Union Army on 3 days, failed to dislodge them, and he has suffered so many casualties, he knows the campaign cannot continue. So thankfully, the next day for him, heavy rains move in, which allows his army to break off from the engagement and head back towards the Potomac River and to safety.
Tim, a brilliant summary of the events of the Battle of Gettysburg. Dr. Chris Parry, to bring you in, I suppose the first question to ask is, did Lee need to engage the Union forces at Gettysburg in the first place?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, I don't think Lee was looking to engage the Army of the Potomac unless he was forced to come into action. He was trying basically to draw it up towards Harrisburg, capital of Pennsylvania. He didn't realize how close he was being shadowed to the east at the time. And certainly when General Ewell, one of his corps commanders, arrives in Gettysburg, coming down from the north, he's told specifically, I don't want a general engagement here. And this accounts for the fact why Ewell doesn't actually take Culp's Hill initially when it's unoccupied by the Union forces. And as you can see, it commands the whole of this flank of the Union Army. And it's absolutely critical to them being able to survive. And we have to remember that at the start of the battle, as Tim said, you've got two Union Corps, the 1st and the 11th, being driven back onto Cemetery Hill and Ridge here in complete disorder. And had they taken Culp's Hill on day one, it would have been absolutely decisive for that flank there. Same as the Little Round Top, which is another feature here. If the Confederates had been able to capture that, they would have been able absolutely to roll up the whole of the line. But interestingly, when they were stabilizing the situation here in the north, one of the best generals in the Union Army, Hancock, arrives and he says, this is the best place I've ever seen to actually fight a battle. And that's why the Union decides to stay on this ridgeline and then occupy Culp's Hill. And as Tim will know, there is a desperate fight over Culp Hill, over Little Round Top the following day. And that really is decisive. The Confederate inability to take these features and also to expose the Union line is a real problem here. But I think by the time Ewell's divisions have been committed in the north, by the time Lee has brought all his divisions together to the west here on Seminary Ridge, Longstreet's there. He hasn't got his cavalry at the moment, most of his cavalry under Jeb Stuart, which are out doing a big extended raid to the east of the Union Army, trying to keep tabs on it, but not doing so. He's thinking, okay, I fancy this. He's also just heard that General Hooker isn't actually leading the Army of the Potomac, and he's been replaced by one of the corps commanders, General Meade, who gets the job just 3 days before. He doesn't underestimate Meade, though. He actually says, I'm not going to catch Meade out, and if I make a mistake, he'll have a go at me. So he doesn't underestimate him. He knows Meade's a competent general, but he fancies his chances. Once Ewell is committed in the north, he brings all his other troops up, and he decides to fight. And as Tim said earlier on, he's got an army that is won at Chancellorsville and also at Fredericksburg before. What surprises me about this is that Lee in the past has used a lot of sort of maneuver on the battlefield. Frontal attacks aren't really Lee's style. So he tries on the flanks on 2 days, but then he goes for this frontal attack, which is extraordinary. And that is entirely down to what he said afterwards. He said, I had an overwhelming belief in the prowess and valor of my troops.
Tim, let's bring you in. I mean, so many points to unpick there. Let's start with Little Round Top. I mean, they came so close to taking Little Round Top. Was it 5 assaults on Little Round Top? I mean, had they taken it, what impact would that have had on the entire battle?
The Little Round Top is one of the most important terrain features on the battlefield, and it figures very prominently into the second day's fighting. If you ever visit Gettysburg, it is one of the must-see features of the battlefield because it offers an incredible vista of the entirety of the field, right? Now, it anchors the Union left. That's its main purpose on July the 2nd. But another important thing that it does is it also protects one of the Union's supply lines, the Taneytown Road. There's a road that runs in the rear of the Union line, south from Gettysburg, kind of on the east side of Cemetery Ridge, and then behind Little Round Top. And one of the things you want to have is open supply lines, because it's sort of an important military maxim of 19th century warfare that you have a way out. Because if the enemy were to cut that position and you stay and fight and you lose, then your army is surrounded. It's forced to surrender or just be annihilated in general. Okay, so if Little Round Top were to fall to Confederate forces, General Meade, the Union Army commander, would have really no recourse but to give up the field, right? And he's under a lot of political pressure as well, because he's a brand new officer. He's in command of an army. He's lost men already, and he wants to make sure that their sacrifice means something. He's in this fight to win it. So if the Confederates get Little Round Top, they have a wonderful position where they can view the entirety of the Union line. They might be able to get artillery up on top of Little Round Top and fire down the Union line to dislodge the center of the Union position. And then, again, most importantly, they can cut the Taneytown Road, which potentially forces Meade to kind of forfeit the battlefield generally. Now, the attack on Little Round Top is a tough call for the Confederates. They have to ascend a very rugged terrain. And what happens on the second day is initially Little Round Top is occupied by the Union 3rd Corps. It's the corps that is assigned to the Union left. But then around 2 p.m., the commander of the 3rd Corps, Major General Daniel Sickles, abandons the hill before there's even an engagement there. He decides to move his entire corps about a mile west to a different position called the Peach Orchard. And he has left Little Round Top unguarded. So when the Confederate assault rolls forward at 4 p.m., the Union Army has to scramble to send troops there to occupy it. So there is a reserve unit called the 5th Corps, which is kind of right in between the two Union flanks at a position called Powers Hill. It has to make a forced march to the summit of Little Round Top, and the lead brigade that gets there under Colonel Strong Vincent gets there within 5 minutes before the Confederates show up. 5 minutes. So if they had been delayed by anything, the Confederates probably would have occupied Little Round Top without a fight, and then it would have been Union forces trying to charge up the hill and dislodge them. But the thing about it is Little Round Top is a defender's dream. It is steep, it is rocky, it is a great place to deploy infantry as a defending army, but it is not a great place to attack.
Tim, if I'm thinking like Lee normally thinks, what I can't understand when I look at the battlefield is why Longstreet's corps wasn't used to flank all the way around to the south of the Round Tops and actually cut those roads and come into the flank here. This seems to me the typical Chancellorsville type maneuver to be able to do that. So, if you're entrenched on these ridge lines here, obviously what you need to do is actually flank round to the south. And I just don't understand why that wasn't an option on the day.
Yeah, and that concern that you have was actually echoed by a Confederate general who commanded the division that was all the way on the Confederate right, so the one that's opposite the Union left, Major General John Bell Hood. Before the Confederates attacked the Union left at 4 p.m., right when Hood is getting into position on a ridge called Warfield Ridge, Hood makes this suggestion that it would be safer to just kind of leave the main body of the Confederate Army, swing south around Little Round Top and its neighboring sister hill, Big Round Top, and cut the Taneytown Road rather than assault the Union position where they are. But he is overruled by his corps commander, James Longstreet. And Longstreet's concern is a legitimate one, because he knows that what his corps is supposed to do is to attack simultaneous with a Confederate assault on the Union right? And so they have to happen simultaneously, and he knows that if he sends Hood's division on this long flank march, it is going to be towards dusk by the time they're in position and able to attack. And by that point, the assault against the Union right may have fizzled out, and this simultaneous coordinated assault will not occur. And so Longstreet believes he is more beholden to the Confederate troops that are attacking the Union right, Richard Ewell's corps, than he is to this idea from one of his division commanders, General Hood. So, in modern times, this would be an easy thing to fix because we have radio communication and telephones and cell phones. If the Confederates had iPhones that could text each other, they could solve this crisis. But back then, the only way you can communicate is through direct face-to-face contact with couriers or through signal flags, which are not always reliable. And again, think about that Confederate position. It is some 4 miles to go from the Confederate right to the Confederate left. And you have to go all the way around the line. This is the problem of the Confederate Army at Gettysburg, is they have the exterior lines of battle where communication is strained and attenuated. So, Chris, like your suggestion is a good one, but I think in execution would have been utterly impractical because of the specific tactical needs the Confederate Army had to face.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, to me, you always read in Southern literature the idea of achieving a Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's victory over the Romans. And it seems to me that Gettysburg is actually set up for that, because if, you get Ewell's corps coming around the rear here of the Union right and the Longstreet Corps coming around to the south, you've got an enveloping action and you've got very static sort of Union troops facing the wrong way. As you say, the coordination issue is the problem. Of course, a lot of the Confederate Corps arrived in dribs and drabs. They didn't arrive together on the battlefield. But you can see the possibilities for this, even if, we're looking at a map here that's almost sort of contemporaneous. And with the blocks on there, you can see the envelopment action could actually take place. You block the communications down to Washington and Baltimore, which is obviously kryptonite to the Union generals. And you've got an envelopment action. It's an interesting, it's just so unlike Lee, this battle. That's the way I think about it.
I mean, there are so many what ifs as to how the Battle of Gettysburg could have played out differently. In a moment, we're going to move on to what the long-term historical consequences might have been had it ended up with a different result. I suppose, Tim, one of the really big what ifs is what if Pickett's charge doesn't happen?
Right. That's kind of the most disastrous moment for the Confederates is their big gamble on the 3rd, this frontal assault, where they kind of lean into this idea that the Union center is going to be the weak part of the line. Now, the reason that Lee thinks this is because he's attacked the flanks twice, right? He's attacked the Union right and left on the afternoon of July the 2nd, and he attacks the Union right again on the morning of July the 3rd. And Lee supposes that in the course of these 2 days of fighting, General Meade has stripped the center to reinforce the left and right. That's the weak link. So he just thinks he has to pulverize it with artillery and then send some of his best troops in a frontal assault, and it will snap the Union Army in twain and then dislodge it and send it retreating down on these roads. And I think one of the reasons that Lee does this is because one of the things that has been eluding Lee at all of his other victories is the fruits of this victory. He beats Union generals time and again, but what happens is the Union Army retreats every time, and it refills its ranks, it replenishes its losses, and it comes back again. So he's never been able to get a truly decisive victory that destroys the Union Army. And that has been his one major goal as a general, is to annihilate the Army of the Potomac so it cannot invade his home state of Virginia. And so I think what he's doing at Gettysburg is he's trying to master the killing stroke, which is something he had not quite achieved in any of these other battles. And so Pickett's charge is the moment he thinks has come when he can do that. And that's why I think he does something that is kind of uncharacteristic for him, a frontal assault, because I think that's his solution to his earlier failure to deliver this killing blow to the Army of the Potomac.
It's interesting, isn't it? I see Gettysburg as a perfect opportunity to redo Chancellorsville, so where you get the Union attacked on both sides. And yet Lee opts for reversing the situation at Fredericksburg, where the Union Army attacked a very heavily entrenched and fortified Confederate army and suffered really badly. It's really interesting how the lessons don't seem to be applied at Gettysburg that people have seen in the previous year.
Yeah, you're exactly right. Even Union forces kind of recognized how the shoe was on the other foot. Famously at Pickett's charge, when Confederate forces were retreating, the Union defenders started shouting Fredericksburg, Fredericksburg, reminding them that they had to endure this, several months earlier along the Rappahannock River. But I think one of the things we always have to remember is that Union and Confederate generals were all generally West Pointers, right? They had all had the same kind of education. And West Point education, both in the classroom and then practically during the Mexican-American War, when all these officers were lieutenants and captains, they had taught the value of the tactical offensive. They always say, what you want to be is the person attacking, right? Because that way the enemy reacts to your movements, you don't react to the enemy. And I think sometimes in translation, this means fix bayonets and attack the enemy where they are, no matter how strong their defense is. And I think this is something that all Civil War generals are kind of coping with, is the fact these tactics that may have worked really well 12 years earlier during the Mexican-American War aren't achieving the same results in the Civil War.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how relatively small tactical decisions could have had a massive impact had they panned out differently. Let's zoom out now and let's ask ourselves some really big questions as to what history today might look like had the Battle of Gettysburg played out differently. Okay, let's get into some really big what-ifs now. And I suppose, Tim, that the place we should start, and we are going to focus mainly on what if the Confederacy ends up winning at Gettysburg, what is the impact on that? But what if the Union had an even more decisive victory? Because, of course, what happens is Lee is able to withdraw over the Potomac. If that can't happen, if that doesn't happen, and the Union have a really crushing victory at Gettysburg, even more so, what's the impact? Does that shorten the war? Do the Union win even sooner?
Potentially, yes, right? It could easily shorten the war. And as a point of fact, I mean, the Union nearly does win its really decisive victory on July the 13th, because Union forces under General Meade pursue the Confederacy to the banks of the Potomac River, and they actually have Lee backed against the wall. Unfortunately, General Meade delays, and then Lee escapes in the middle of the night across the Potomac River on pontoon bridges. And Abraham Lincoln was so incensed about it that he wrote a letter that chastised General Meade and said, "Your golden opportunity is gone, and I am immeasurably distressed by it." Now, he never sent the letter because he wrote it in anger, and then he put it in his drawer and then never signed it and never sent it. It's found in his papers in the 20th century. But there was the potential that Lee's army could have been destroyed before it escaped into friendly territory. And if it had been, then yeah, potentially it could have spelled an end to the Confederate plea for independence a lot sooner, maybe a year sooner. It's important to realize that this campaign in Pennsylvania is not the only major disaster befalling the Confederates. They also will lose their most important bastion on the Mississippi River one day after Gettysburg, Vicksburg, which is the last way that the Confederates can block the Union Navy from ascending or descending the Mississippi River, is seized by General Ulysses S. Grant's army on Independence Day, 1863. And that is a terrific blow against the Confederate strategic picture. Probably more important than Gettysburg even. And then there's also a Union invasion of Tennessee. There's an army called the Army of the Cumberland that is making a march from Nashville down to Chattanooga. And that campaign, which is a relatively bloodless campaign, will be complete by September of 1863, which means an entire Confederate state, Tennessee, is now in Union hands. And further, there is a Union army that is creeping up on the Sea Island, that is sort of blockading Charleston, one of the most important ports on the Atlantic coast. So all of these taken together really paint a gloomy picture for the Confederacy. Now, the question is, does that change Confederate morale? Well, that's the great what if that we can't really determine. But if Lee's army is just destroyed, utterly annihilated and captured, then the Confederacy has lost really its greatest, most iconic army before the re-election of Abraham Lincoln. And that's a possibility that the Confederates just sue for peace.
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing, Tim, of course, is right before Gettysburg, there's this tremendous movement amongst the Union forces the On to Richmond movement. And of course, the Gettysburg campaign in part is designed to try and prevent that happening again in the season of 1863. So had Lee's army been destroyed before it got across the Potomac at Williamsport to get into safe territory, you can see that Meade's army will be used straight away to march on Richmond, which is a distinct possibility. And there are no forces that can be brought to bear by the Confederacy quick enough if Meade marches on Richmond. So the Confederate capital is immediately under pressure, just as obviously the Union capital of Washington, which is not very far away from Gettysburg, would have been under pressure if Lee had annihilated Meade at Gettysburg.
I mean, so many what ifs that spring from this. I suppose you could say, let's say the Civil War ends in 1864 as opposed to 1865. Does John Wilkes Booth go into the theatre that day? Does Abraham Lincoln get assassinated? I mean, the point about Lincoln is genuinely fascinating, Tim, because, of course, he was re-elected in the autumn of 1864. He was up against a candidate for the Democrats, McClellan, who was, well, would it be fair to call him a copperhead? What was his position?
Yeah, it's tricky to pin down McClellan's political position. He was a general who's actually a former commander of the Army of the Potomac. So he was a war candidate. However, he was on a peace platform, right? So the Democratic Party, which is the minority party in the North, is a mix of war Democrats who are in favor of the war, but not in favor of Lincoln's prosecution of it, and peace Democrats who are derisively known as Copperheads, who are willing to actually accept Confederate demands for independence. So when the convention is organized in Chicago in August 1864, the Democrats have kind of a mixed view of the Civil War. They have a former Union general as the head of the ticket. They have a vice presidential candidate who is a peace Democrat, but then their main political plank is a peace plank. And they say that after 4 years of failure, the Democratic Party, if elected, is willing to kind of accept the possibility of an armistice. So I think this is the closest the Confederates come to achieving their political goals, is getting McClellan elected. Yeah. And all they really have to do this is simply continue to bleed the North dry in their defense of their territory enough that Lincoln cannot win the election in November 1864, and a new administration comes in and is willing to bargain with the Confederacy.
Interestingly, if you go back to the Gettysburg campaign, the Confederate government under Jefferson Davis is actually timing the campaign to a peace overture by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens. And what happens after Gettysburg is that Lincoln refuses to allow Stephens to come through the Union lines to actually conduct those negotiations in 1863. So one direct result of Gettysburg is that a peace campaign in 1863 stalled in its tracks. Lincoln won't talk to the Confederacy about any sort of peace talks at that stage. So, as always, as Clausewitz memorably said, war is an extension of politics by other means. And this is classically brought out at every stage of the Civil War. And what the Confederacy is trying to do is win a political victory, as Tim says, by saying to the Union, look, it's just not worth your while.
Yeah, and I suppose also, what you don't get if you don't get a Union victory at Gettysburg, you don't get the Gettysburg Address a few months later, because, of course, Lincoln has gone there to unveil a memorial. That's gone down in folklore. His status is dramatically undermined as a result. So let's imagine a scenario, Tim, in which the Confederacy has agreed an armistice and the Confederacy is established as an independent nation. I mean, there are so many what-ifs that flow from that. Just to throw one at you to kick things off. Does the Union keep its capital in Washington? Because you might say it is uncomfortably close to the Confederacy.
Yeah, it's a great question. It is uncomfortably close to the Confederacy. It would literally share a border with a nation that it had been fighting. It's very difficult to say. I think a lot of it, again, depends on the surrounding countryside. Maryland, as Chris pointed out, was a slave state when the Civil War began, but then it, by its own volition, issues emancipation in November of 1864. So it becomes free territory before the end of the war. And I think that makes Washington, D.C. a little bit more comfortable because now it's surrounded by a friendly government. However, it is possible that you may have to move Washington, D.C. because, if in the future these two nations mean to carry on peaceable relations, there could always be the worry of spies slipping in and out of Washington across the Potomac River and then, taking precious diplomatic information back to the Confederate States of America. And we have every reason to believe this could happen because it did happen during the Civil War. There were Confederate sympathizers in Washington, D.C. who regularly fled across the Potomac River to give the Confederates information about military movements. And I would imagine that the U.S. government would probably want to keep their government further away from that kind of political intrigue and espionage. Where they would set up, I don't know, but Washington, D.C. as a capital, its days might be numbered.
Yeah, it could be Philadelphia, it could be New York, who knows? I suppose one of the things we do have to address, Dr. Chris Parry, is the issue of slavery in the Confederacy. How long does that last? Because presumably at some point there would be, sanctions, almost a bit like apartheid South Africa faced sanctions.
Well, I think it's probably more direct and subtle than that. If you look at where the Confederacy would have traded after this, just think, so the British are all over the West Indies. Quite a lot of cotton goes to Britain as well. The closest ally that the Confederacy are likely to have is probably going to be England and the British Empire. So you've got a country, England, that has said, we're actually suppressing slavery now. So a condition of you trading with us actually is that you abolish slavery. So it might have happened anyway, to tell you the truth. And so the pressure to actually obviously grow an economy, to actually get out there in the world to be able to trade and things like that might have been dependent very much on abolishing slavery. So it may have taken a bit longer, but with the pressure coming from the British Empire and Britain in particular, I would think it would have been necessary to do something about that. I mean, there's a lot of myths about slavery. I think, quite a lot of people in the South didn't keep slaves, for example. 5% of people owned 20 or more slaves. The whole system itself was actually decaying very rapidly. So I think, at the end of the Civil War, probably within a generation, slavery would have disappeared. And it may actually have developed in a more progressive and more positive way than it actually did, because so many accommodations had to be made to integrate the South back into the Northern system again, that you ended up, I think, as we have a system, the results of that system can be seen today. So you might have had a smoother process. What I find interesting is the geopolitical issue. So if you look at America's expansion to the west here, would we have seen a divided expansion to the west? And the Confederacy, for example, going into this territory here, New Mexico, Arizona, even California.
Does it even go into Mexico?
Well, absolutely, James. So there's obviously a drive, and would the southern states been orientated south towards Central America? Who builds the Panama Canal? Under those circumstances, is it the Union or is it the Confederacy? Big
questions already. Just park that for one moment. We'll come back to that. Tim, I do want to bring you in on the slavery point. How long do you think slavery would have lasted in an independent Confederacy?
Oh, there's no telling. It's important to realize that the Confederates' goal of preserving slavery is not just about the economics of it, but it is also about matters of racial control. The slave owners of the Confederacy made it very clear when the war begins that this is not just about profiting off the institution, but it's also about making a tiered system where African Americans are considered to be the inferior race. So there's a speech that is delivered by the Vice President of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, in March of 1861, called the Cornerstone Speech, where he clarifies the meaning of the Confederacy. And he says that the cornerstone upon which the Confederacy rests is the fundamental belief that African Americans are not equal to white men. And this is a thing that most of the white South believed in. And so one of the things I would say is that despite the fact that there could be international pressure from future Confederate allies to do away with slavery, the Confederacy will take incredible steps to ensure that white supremacy remains. And this, as an American, this is a nightmarish scenario that I just shudder to contemplate, because it takes a good 100 years for this country to produce a national civil rights act and a voting rights act in the 1960s. And so that's how long after slavery happens before we get a concerted effort to bring about civil rights. And the only way that that happens is that when Civil War ends, we get a 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery and a 14th Amendment that makes federal citizenship a guarantee. That leads immediately to African Americans holding political office, voting in national elections, voting for people to represent their interests. And in the Confederacy, if they won the war and they preserved slavery for how many generations, civil rights would have been held back. And I would argue, even today in the 21st century, we would still not have it in the American South.
So you think, Tim, it's feasible slavery goes on into the 20th century in the Confederacy?
In my opinion, yes, because of the connection between white supremacy and slavery. I think, Tim, the issue here is, I think it splits, doesn't it? Whether it's slavery. I think the issue is the supremacy argument. I think my contention is, I think slavery would have had to disappear for the Confederacy to survive as a social economic entity. It's got lots of resources, but it has to trade. But you're right. I think the issue is about supremacy. If slavery had disappeared within a generation, as I believe, the supremacist arguments would have persisted. And again, as you said, James, it would have been very much like white South Africa and black South Africa, the way it went.
You'd have an even more aggressive form of segregation.
Segregation rather than anything else, both horizontally and within society. So Gettysburg, for me, results, I think, either way, in slavery being abolished, I think, within a generation, but this supremacist argument persisting. Let's face it, I mean, that did persist into the almost to the 21st century, and I think that's the more natural progression. I mean, I think Tim explained that very, very articulately in some ways,
Tim, final thought from you on slavery, and then we'll come on to some of the geopolitics.
I mean, I said what I said. The Civil War is the war that ends the largest slave society in the New World, and it's important to kind of comprehend that slavery did not die any sort of natural death here in North America. It had to be ended through violence, and that is the long-term legacy of the Civil War. Is that it was the moment that Americans finally lived up to the promise they had made in 1776. This was a nation where all men would be created equal.
And as expressed in the Gettysburg...
For 80 years, they hadn't lived up to that. And that's why the Gettysburg Address is, in my opinion, one of the most important speeches, right? Because that's where Lincoln articulates this.
Absolutely.
And if the people of the free states did not know it already, the Gettysburg Address made it clear that this was not just a war to reunite the nation, it was also a war to end slavery.
Let's come on to the geopolitics, because there are so many what-ifs here. Dr. Chris Parry, you've got the Confederacy as an independent nation, you've got the North, the Union, as an independent nation. The United States of America, as we know it now as a project, never happened. Presumably that means that the North, or the US of what remains of it, is not top country in the 20th century.
Well, I don't know. I think sandwiched between Canada and the Confederate States, you've got quite a mighty nation here. There's no question. You've got a continent-sized country that's expanding to the west. It's got two major oceans either side of it. I think it still could have actually made it, to tell you the truth. And here's another thing. Don't count against, basically, the southern states and the northern states coming together again.
Okay.
So they might have actually had joint interests here. At one stage, there was a suggestion that when you've got 1 million in your army in the Union, we might go and take Canada as well. And one of the big fears of the British Empire was that that would happen. But let's not obviously upset the Union, because they might turn their army on completion of this war to the north and take over Canada as well.
So you think the North think, hang on, we've lost the South, we need to expand, we'll go north, we'll go into Canada?
Possibly, yeah. So there's a real issue here. I think this is a huge entity in the middle here. And essentially, I mean, as you say, if the Confederacy had gone into Mexico, for example, you're looking at a very large state to the south, but there's enough here to sustain a world power. There's no question about that. Let's face it, look at the size of Britain. I mean, you've got enough resources here in terms of manpower, land, natural resources.
Most of the wealth is concentrated in the north.
And the industry is here. And as long as, of course, you kept friendly relations with the Confederacy, you can survive. You can become a superpower if you want to. Anything could have happened there. You could have had two superpowers here.
Tim, fascinated to get your thoughts on this. Yeah, it's a difficult question to answer. I think Chris has a really strong point that there could have been a reunion later on based on international politics, because as we know, in the 1890s, the United States decides to embark upon kind of its own imperialist ventures. And I think they would be stronger as a reunited nation. The only kind of hitch to this is the actual history of the memory of the war is very sectional. You know, even with a reunited nation, former Union and Confederate soldiers really despise each other's interpretations of the war. So there's a lot of kind of sectional division well into the 20th century, even until the last Civil War veteran leaves the stage in the 1950s. So we cannot discount the fact that sectional animosity coming from the war persists for a very long time, and that could actually prevent a possible reunification. And, how that changes 20th century history, we don't know. It's entirely possible that America might not play as prominent a role in the 20th century, even in the world wars, if it is divided. There's a very strong neutrality movement in the 1930s. And who knows if you have a divided nation, whether it is strong enough to actually keep the U.S. out of World War II. The big questions that we can't answer, but again, it just makes me shudder to think of what the world would be like if it was two different countries.
Chris, I mean, we're getting into the realm of wild speculation, but heck, this is what we love on History Undone. I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, do either of the American nations, as it were, take a side in the wars?
Well, it depends on their geopolitical complexion at the time. I mean, as Tim points out, there's a strong isolationist element. It may well be that they take different sides. If you've still got a very strong white supremacist element in the Southern Confederacy, some of the fascist views are actually very attractive. Some of the eugenics that are portrayed by the totalitarian regimes in Europe align with that. I mean, that's a really nightmare situation. Just think about a Southern Confederate state that is actually aligned with some of the totalitarian states, while the conventional United States is actually aligned with the democracies.
But you see, you could almost make the argument both ways, because you could say the Confederacy might have been on the side of the Allies, because it may have had a very long-standing relationship with Britain, dating back to its inception in the 1860s. And I mean, on that, Tim, to bring you in, do you think in the latter part of the 19th century the Confederacy would have had quite a close alliance with Britain?
Potentially. Britons were very divided about the Civil War, right? Generally, the working class British subjects were aligned with the North. They kind of saw a lot of themselves in Northern factory workers, but then the British aristocracy was more supporting the Confederacy. They were the ones that were helping to raise money to build raiding ships and blockade runners for the Confederacy. So potentially, if the Confederacy became independent, they would have a strong ally in some of the wealthiest people in Great Britain that could have easily been nurtured deep into the 19th century. So one of the reasons we might say the Confederacy might avoid the possibility of a reunification with the North is simply because it has much stronger allies over in Europe. Difficult to speculate, but there are some historical precedents that kind of suggest that the Confederacy does not turn its attention to its own continent, but looks elsewhere for allies.
I mean, interesting, James. I mean, if the 20th century had played out differently, the Confederacy could be part of the Commonwealth now.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. Yeah. And do either of them even have a space program? Do we end up in a situation, Tim, I mean, this is wild speculation, where you've got a Confederate flag on the moon?
Well, of course, it's easier to get it's easier to get spacecraft off the planet, of course, closer to the equator.
Yeah,
that's why you've got Cape Canaveral down in Florida. So you've got a point there, James. But let's not underestimate the power of this country here in the middle.
Yeah,
it's going to be really powerful. There's no question about that. I mean, the Confederacy will be a totally different character because the topography and everything else is different. As I said, I think it would have faced southwest. I think California may have been under pressure from the Confederacy, but instead of having two big countries here in the north, you'd have had three probably. But a lot's got to happen after Gettysburg. It's not just Gettysburg alone, as Tim pointed out. Vicksburg is about to fall. The Confederacy is split, of course, by the Vicksburg campaign. And things were not looking good at that stage. It's not just Gettysburg. I mean, Lee himself said, it's not a big deal, Gettysburg. I wanted to give them a licking. We did give them a licking, he said. But they didn't consider it decisive on its own.
Tim, I want to give the final thoughts to you.
Yeah, I think 2 points. Definitely in agreement with Chris that Gettysburg has been often called a turning point. I think this is a little bit overblown because the Confederacy was far from being defeated in the summer of 1863. Despite the fact that it loses Tennessee, despite the fact that it loses the Mississippi River, despite the fact that it loses at Gettysburg, there's still a lot of territory that it holds and a lot of fight left in it, right? So I think their best opportunity for victory came in 1864, again, with the potential of unseating Abraham Lincoln. And I think the way that finally was lost to them was when they lost Atlanta. I think that's the most important campaign of the Civil War, when William Tecumseh Sherman and his armies take Atlanta, Georgia in September of 1864. That makes the return of Abraham Lincoln to the presidency all but a done deal. And the other kind of big point I think that our listeners really need to think about is if the Confederacy won the Civil War, what the consequences would have been for representative government. Because you've got to think about how the war came about. It is an election that half the country refused to accept. And so the United States is one of the only kind of republics in the world that is fully functioning. And there are many other countries across the world that are hoping that it will stand the test of time and that people can create governments where they are the ones who vote for the people who lead them. And you've had a moment here where there is an election. Abraham Lincoln is the clear winner, but then half of the United States says we don't like the political platform he stands on. We are going to leave. I mean, what happens to representative government after that? If you can set the precedent that if you don't like the result of election, you can just create your own separate country. Potentially, the United States could continue to keep splitting and splitting until it was just a small number of states again, and there would be no U.S. government at all. So that's why the Civil War is so supremely important. Not only does it kill off the biggest slave society in the New World, not only does it shape international politics for generations to come, but it also preserves democracy.
So many what ifs that all flow from the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. I think we can speculate that had Lee won at Gettysburg, Abraham Lincoln doesn't win re-election in 1864. An armistice is agreed between the northern states and the Confederacy. You essentially have two independent nations side by side. Whether that means we end up with the USA as the world superpower that we know in the 20th and 21st century is a massive question. Maybe the Southern Confederacy expands westwards and indeed into Mexico to its south. Which sides do the northern states and the Confederacy take in the world wars of the 20th century? What happens to slavery? Does it continue into the 20th century? And what does the world look like today? Some massive questions. That is the beauty of History Undone, but I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. My thanks to Dr Timothy Orr and Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry for joining me. We will be back undoing more battles from history very soon, but in the meantime, remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, History Undone with James Hanson on YouTube. And you can also catch me presenting Frontline on Times Radio. That's it from us. Goodbye.